For over 2 decades, the British government sprayed its own cities with cancer-linked chemicals and live bacteria and never told a single soul. Millions of ordinary people across southern England went about their daily lives while military aircraft, naval vessels, and unmarked vehicles released clouds of zinc, cadmium, sulfide, and bacterial agents over their homes, their schools, their children. They had no knowledge, they gave no consent. And when the truth finally surfaced, the Ministry of Defense had a single, astonishing defense. It was harmless. But the story of how a democratic government came to treat its own population as an open-air laboratory begins not with a bureaucratic memo, but with an island so contaminated it would remain off-limits for nearly half a century. In 1942, at the height of the Second World War, British military scientists detonated anthrax bombs on Gruinard Island off the northwest coast of Scotland. The goal was straightforward: to determine whether biological weapons could be deployed effectively against enemy populations. The sheep brought to the island died within days. The soil remained lethally contaminated until a massive decontamination effort in the late 1980s. Gruinard proved the concept. Biological agents could be weaponized and dispersed across a target area with devastating effect. But the island trials raised a more troubling question, one that would drive the next 3 decades of secret experimentation. How would such agents behave over a real landscape, with real buildings, real weather patterns, and real people? The answer would come from Porton Down, the sprawling chemical and biological warfare establishment in Wiltshire that had operated since the First World War. Under figures like David Henderson, who headed the biology department during this critical period, Porton Down began shifting its attention from isolated test sites to the British mainland itself. What no one outside a small circle of military planners knew, what wouldn't become public for 60 years, was just how far they were willing to go. The first covert open-air trials began quietly in the late 1940s and escalated through the 1950s. Porton Down scientists selected areas across southern England, towns, farmland, coastal stretches, and released zinc-cadmium sulfide particles into the air. The fluorescent compound was chosen as a simulant tracer. Its particles, fine enough to remain airborne for hours, would mimic the dispersal behavior of actual biological weapons. By tracking where the particles settled, researchers could model how a real attack would unfold across populated terrain. The public was told nothing. No warnings were issued. No consent was sought. Local councils were not informed. The rationale, preserved in documents that would not surface for decades, was national security. Britain needed to understand its vulnerability to Soviet biological attack, and that understanding required data that could only be gathered over real cities with real population densities. The people living in those cities were, in the coldest possible terms, the experiment. Zinc-cadmium sulfide was not the only agent released during these early trials. Bacterial simulants, organisms chosen because they were believed to be harmless while behaving similarly to weaponized pathogens, were also dispersed near populated areas. The assumption of harmlessness would later prove far more fragile than its architects imagined. But throughout the 1950s, the program expanded with the confidence of men who believed they were protecting the nation from a threat that justified any method. Between 1953 and 1964, naval vessels took up station in Lyme Bay, off the Dorset coast, and began spraying massive quantities of zinc-cadmium sulfide toward the shoreline. The operations were methodical. Ships positioned themselves at predetermined coordinates and released plumes of the fluorescent compound, while monitoring stations onshore tracked the particles as they drifted inland. The results confirmed what the planners suspected and feared: airborne agents released offshore could penetrate miles into the English countryside, settling over towns and villages, entering homes through open windows, carried on the lungs of people who had no idea what they were breathing. The Dorset coast was chosen for its geography and prevailing wind patterns, but the communities along that coast were not abstractions on a map. East Lulworth, Weymouth, and surrounding villages were home to families, to children, to the elderly, and the vulnerable. Monitoring data showed particles reaching as far inland as Salisbury, roughly 30 miles from the release point. The scale of exposure was enormous, and it was entirely invisible. The consequences of these coastal trials would take years to surface. But first, the program was about to grow far larger. In 1961, the program reached a new order of magnitude. Under the codename Operation Large Area Coverage, Royal Air Force aircraft flew repeated sorties along routes stretching from the South Dorset coast to the tip of Norfolk, spraying zinc cadmium sulfide across thousands of square miles of English countryside. The operation continued until at least 1963. Its purpose was to simulate the dispersal pattern of a full-scale Soviet biological attack on the British mainland, to answer the question of how completely a weaponized agent could blanket the country. The flight paths crossed over cities, market towns, and farming communities. Norwich, Salisbury, and dozens of smaller settlements lay directly beneath the spray corridors. The fluorescent particles, invisible to the naked eye, settled on rooftops and roads, on crops and water supplies, on playgrounds and parks. Monitoring stations scattered across the target zone recorded the results, building a picture of how thoroughly an airborne agent could penetrate the national landscape. The data was exactly what defense planners wanted. It demonstrated that a determined attacker could expose millions of British citizens to a biological agent using a relatively small number of delivery systems. The irony that the British government had just done precisely that to its own people was apparently lost on the program's architects. Or perhaps it was simply considered an acceptable cost of preparedness. The most chilling trials took place not over open countryside, but deep beneath the streets of London. In the dice trials of the 1960s, Porton-Down scientists carried bacterial spores into the London Underground and released them on the platforms and in the tunnels. The organism of choice was Bacillus globigii, selected because it was considered a safe simulant for the far deadlier Bacillus anthracis, anthrax. The underground was a perfect testing environment. Its enclosed tunnels, rushing air currents, and dense passenger loads replicated the conditions under which a terrorist or hostile agent might deploy a biological weapon in a major city. Researchers tracked how the spores traveled through the network, carried on trains from station to station, inhaled by commuters who packed the carriages during rush hour. Millions of Londoners passed through the system during the testing period. None of them knew. For decades, the official position held that Bacillus globigii was entirely harmless to humans. That certainty would not survive scientific scrutiny. In 1999, Professor Brian Spratt of Imperial College London confirmed that Bacillus globigii is closely related to Bacillus anthracis at the genetic level and is not the benign organism it had long been claimed to be. It can cause infections, particularly in individuals with compromised immune systems. The safe simulant had never been safe at all, and it had been released into the lungs of millions. The program did not end cleanly. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, testing continued at reduced scale. The Lime Bay trials persisted until at least 1975, with a vessel called the Ice Whale continuing to release bacterial agents and chemical compounds off the south coast. The operations had become routine, a bureaucratic process with its own logistics, its own personnel, its own quiet momentum. Meanwhile, in the communities that had served as unwitting test sites, people were beginning to notice patterns they could not explain. Residents of East Lulworth and surrounding areas reported unusual clusters of miscarriages and birth defects during the years of heaviest testing. Families who had lived healthy lives for generations found themselves dealing with cancers and respiratory illnesses at rates that seemed to defy coincidence. They had no framework for connecting their suffering to government activity. They had no way of knowing what had been done to them. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies cadmium compounds as Group 1 carcinogens, substances with confirmed links to lung cancer and kidney damage. The communities along the Dorset coast had been breathing cadmium-laced particles for years, and then came the moment that would define everything that followed, not an admission of guilt, but the slow, grudging emergence of truth. The wall of secrecy held for decades. It might have held indefinitely were it not for the persistence of a single investigative journalist. Rob Evans of The Guardian spent years filing Freedom of Information requests with the Ministry of Defence, probing the classified history of Britain's biological warfare program. Each request met resistance. Each response was partial, redacted, delayed. But Evans kept pressing, and the documentary record began, piece by piece, to emerge. In Parliament, Norman Baker, the Liberal Democrat MP for Lewis, took up the cause. He raised questions about the open-air trials in the House of Commons, demanding answers about what had been released, where, and what the health consequences might have been. The Ministry of Defense offered carefully worded responses that acknowledged the trials had occurred while insisting that no harm had been done. Then, in 2002, the dam broke. The MOD released a report acknowledging more than 100 secret experiments conducted on the British public between 1940 and 1979. The document confirmed the use of zinc, cadmium sulfide, Bacillus globigii, Serratia marcescens, and other agents over populated areas. It confirmed the aerial spraying, the naval releases, the underground trials. 4 decades of secret experimentation on millions of unsuspecting citizens laid out in the dry, clinical language of a government acknowledging what it could no longer plausibly deny. Sue Ellison, the Ministry of Defense spokesperson during the 2002 disclosures, maintained the official line with practiced precision. The agents used were harmless at the concentrations deployed. The trials were a necessary element of national defense. The public had never been at risk. Independent scientists disagreed. The cadmium question alone was damning. Zinc cadmium sulfide may have been released at concentrations the MOD deemed low, but cadmium is a cumulative toxin. It builds in the body over time, settling in the kidneys and lungs. For communities exposed repeatedly over years, the cumulative dose was not trivial, and the MOD's own monitoring data showed particles reaching concentrations far from the release points that exceeded what anyone had predicted. Professor Spratt's findings on Bacillus globigii added another layer of concern. A simulant chosen for its supposed safety had been genetically mischaracterized for decades. The assurance of harmlessness rested on science that turned out to be wrong. No public inquiry was ever held. No compensation was offered to the communities of Dorset, Norfolk, or London. No individual was held accountable for the decision to expose millions of British citizens to carcinogenic compounds and bacterial agents without their knowledge. The MOD's position remained unchanged. The trials were justified, the agents were safe, and the matter was closed. Former Porton Down scientist Jeff Platt, who later wrote about his experiences inside the program, offered a different perspective. The culture at Porton Down, he explained, operated on the assumption that national security overrode individual rights, that the threat of Soviet biological warfare was so severe that any defensive measure was warranted, including measures that treated the British public as experimental subjects. This is the pattern that makes the story significant beyond its specific facts. It is not a story of rogue scientists or maverick generals. It is a story of institutions, of committees that approved budgets, of civil servants who signed requisition orders, of military officers who scheduled flight paths over cities. Every step was authorized. Every decision passed through proper channels, and at no point in those channels did anyone ask whether the millions of people beneath the spray had a right to know what was falling on them. The machinery of secrecy did not malfunction. It worked exactly as designed.